This episode of The Biggest Table is brought to you in part by Wild Goose Coffee. Since 2008, Wild Goose has sought to build better communities through coffee. And for our listeners, Wild Goose is offering a special promotion of 20% off a one-time order using the code TABLE at checkout. To learn more and to order coffee, please visit wildgoosecoffee.com. In this episode of The Biggest Table, I welcome Malcolm Foley, a pastor, historian, and special advisor to the president for equity and campus engagement at Baylor University. We discuss Foley's new book, The Anti-Greed Gospel, which addresses the connections between greed, racism, and economic exploitation inherent in global systems. Foley advocates for a form of Christian socialism focused on sharing resources and combating exploitation and violence. Key topics include the role of the church in challenging societal injustices, the importance of deep economic solidarity, creative anti-violence, and prophetic truth-telling. The conversation also delves into how Christians can navigate their witness in a world dominated by greed and economic disparity, with practical steps for community engagement. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Biggest Table. I am your host, Andrew Camp, and in this podcast, we explore the table, food, eating, and hospitality as an arena for experiencing God's love and our love for one another. And today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Malcolm Foley. Malcolm is a pastor, historian, and speaker who serves as special advisor to the president for equity and campus engagement at Baylor University. He has written for Christianity Today, The Anxious Bench, and Mere Orthodoxy. And he just released his first book from Brazos Press entitled The Anti-Greed Gospel, Why the Love of Money is the Root of Racism and How the Church Can Create a New Way Forward. Foley also co-pastors Mosaic Waco, a multicultural church in Waco, Texas, where he lives with his wife, Desiree. So thanks for joining me today, Malcolm. It's an honor and a privilege, and excited for this conversation.
Good to be with you, Andrew. I'm excited as well.
And as I was reading your bio, I was like, oh, can I actually say that you're still a special advisor to the president for equity and inclusion?
Yep.
Okay.
Until somebody says otherwise. That's what I am.
Awesome. Well, good. Glad you still have a job.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. I'm sure your wife appreciates too. Well, I'm just going to jump into the deep end because I've listened to a few podcasts you've been on and reading your book. And so you hint at it. And so I'm just going to ask it. So your vision for the church in the book, and as you've expressed on podcasts, is a form of Christian socialism. So if our guests aren't going to engage with this podcast, we're giving them an out right away. But why? Why are you advocating for a complete upheaval? And, as good Americans, socialist is a bad word. And so but yeah, I think it actually, you point to something deeper. So why are you advocating for this type of way in the world for the church? And how does it help us make sense of this day and age we're in?
Yeah. Well, the main thing that I want to press for, and I kind of narrate this in the book, is that I want us to see that the political economy in which we find ourselves, the way that resources are currently distributed, and the way that people seek after those resources, it requires exploitation. It requires us to take advantage of each other, and it requires us to basically steal from one another. We're not told to think about, and we're not taught to think about kind of where our resources come from. We're just encouraged to just consume them and produce them, and just kind of go on thinking about those things in those terms. And one of the things that I want to narrate in the book, but also emphasize, particularly for every Christian, is that while our economy tells us that we're fundamentally either producers or consumers, the gospel teaches us that we're fundamentally sharers. So everything that we have is a gift from the Lord, specifically meant to be shared with our neighbors. And so I want folks to invest in an economy that doesn't cater to human greed, but instead seeks to meet human need. So that will strike people. That will strike a number of people as Christian socialism. I have a deep sympathy with Christian socialism, but not in the sense that I'm seeking to kind of overthrow the world economy, because the fact of the matter is that Like that's not my job, and that's also not our job as the that's not our job as the church. Global neoliberal capitalism is just like that's the way that the world that's what's going on in the world right now. And it's similar to the and I understand that in the same category that I understand when Satan goes to Christ this is in the wilderness, the second temptation. He takes him up and says, "Hey, look at the kingdoms of the world, all of their power and their glory, all of it's mine, and I can it's been given to me, and I can give it to whoever I want to. Just bow down and worship me, and it can all be yours." Like I don't think Satan's lying there. I think it's true. He is currently in charge of those things. And yet Jesus' response to that is no, like we only worship the Lord and no one else. And so our response to the temptations of wealth and political power and all those things is not that, like, it's not that Satan doesn't have those things. It's that we don't need them because Christ has already defeated the powers of principalities. And while Satan may reign now, we are looking forward to the day when as we're told in when the seventh trumpet blows in the book of Revelation. What the people say is that the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. Like that's not only the day that we're looking forward to, but that is also the day that we're in now because the kingdom of God has come in Christ. And as the church, we have an opportunity to bear witness to the world that there is another way of living, that there's another way to think about our resources, that there's another way to think about sharing that doesn't require the exploitation and domination of our neighbors.
Wow. I love your tie into Jesus's temptation because, like, I don't think I'd ever thought that, like, oh no, Satan's not lying when he says he has all the kingdoms. Like, yeah, you're probably right. And that's what gets at the, heart of your work is that, greed and this mammon, this God, we can't serve both, God and mammon, like, and so it has wreaked havoc on our world. And you write that mammon lies at the root of lynching, of racial violence, of racial capitalism, and ultimately of the very concept of race itself.
Yeah.
And so I think for many listeners who haven't read your book yet, that's going to, throw them for a curve because it's not the tale we're usually told. So what allowed you to come to this conclusion? Like where? Yeah.
So my research is specifically Black Protestant responses to lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I spent a fair amount of time kind of narrating those responses. But after doing that, I started to ask the question, okay, well, where do these categories come from? Why is this violence why does this violence continue so much and with such brutality? And it and through encountering not only a number of other scholars but also digging deeper into this history, what I found was what I like to call a demonic cycle of self-interest. So it begins in our desire to exploit and dominate each other because we want money and we want power. But because that requires us to put other people in adverse situations, we then have to employ violence to keep them in those positions. But because most of us have consciences, we have to create narratives to tell ourselves, well, I'm not just waking up in the morning to exploit, dominate, and kill my neighbor. Like there's other stuff going on. Yeah. All right. And so the category of race kind of fills that hole. So as one of the historical examples I give, when we think about racialized chattel slavery, when the Portuguese encounter chattel slavery in Africa and decide to get involved, they don't get involved because they're racist. They get involved because they have markets they want to expand. And chattel slavery is a very cheap source of labor. And so then as they then justify that wealth to themselves and to the Pope, that's when these narratives of, well, these people are savages that need to be civilized. They're heathens that need to be Christianized. And so that then justifies for us the fact that we're making a whole bunch of money. But also, like, don't think too much about the fact that we're making a whole bunch of money. Just think about the fact that, like, these people are inferior. We're the superior ones. It's really an act of service that it's a win-win. It's a win.
Yeah.
It's a win for us because we get to make a lot of money. It's a win for them because they get civilized. It's great. And so, but those kinds of narratives are essentially smokescreens for domination and exploitation. And so, one of the things I want to do for people broadly is that I want to expand our conversations about race such that they're not just about the way that we think about each other or the friends that we have or things like that. I want us to remember that when we're having conversations about race and racism, we're having material conversations. We're having conversations about a category that keeps people from getting jobs, that keeps people from getting homes, that keeps people from getting food, like all of these things that are necessary for human sustenance. The category of race is meant to justify systems of economic exploitation that keep those resources out of some people's hands. And so I want, like I said, I want our conversations about race to be deeply material. It's funny because the book in some ways presents itself as a book about race. But one of the arguments that I want to make is that actually it's a smokescreen for a much deeper issue. Hence the fact that I make the claim that that race is a child of mammon, where mammon is the Aramaic word that Jesus uses for riches.
For riches, yeah. And I get that, and it makes a lot of sense until I think about like lynching, and like how do you then like get to a point where you're like, because lynching stories like are horrific. Like there's nothing like disgusting, like, and all of us would be like, nope, we're never going to do that. And yet we're less than 100 years, from this. So like, how do you go from saying like, okay, we want to make money to lynching, dismembering, burning people? Like, that's where I'm like, that feels hard jump, because
I'll walk you through it.
Yeah. Like help our listeners because yeah.
So you have the period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. Probably the only 12 years in American history where we've had focused effort on building a multiracial democracy. Immediately after that, so after the federal troops are pulled out of the South, the federal troops who were there specifically to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Following 1877, you have a period of unprecedented racial violence, because what ends up happening is essentially white Southerners are essentially taking their power back. They're like, we've had 244 years of treating these people like exploitable things. We've had 12 years where we've essentially been forced to treat them as somewhat equals. We're not doing it. We've spent centuries. We've spent literal centuries not doing this. We're not gonna start now. And so you see that not only in the founding of the Klan and in a number of other kind of white supremacist organizations, but you see it in the way that just in the way that labor is treated. Even though technically the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, there's that carve out of unless you've been duly convicted of a crime. And so you have the practice of convict leasing in a number of states where essentially most often black men would be picked up for petty crimes. Sometimes it would be you'd be arrested for vagrancy, that is not having a job in a place where people refuse to give you a job. So you'd be arrested, and then what these employers would do is they would purchase you from the state, and you would then work off your debt to that employer. But the distinction between that and slavery is that during slavery you function as both labor and capital. In this case, you're just labor. So in some cases they would be submitted to even more brutal conditions, to the extent that they'd be worked to death. But then you could just buy another convict, and it's all fine. But all of that's to say, you then get ushered into in many ways a new age of violence. And so lynching pops up in the late 1880s as a form of this kind of violence. And that's also the time when you start to get the narratives of, well, this is only happening because black men sexually assault white women. And so that then, like, that keeps people from digging in too deep, because they're like, oh, well, I mean, I get it. That's why it looks so violent. That's why these people are responding in the way that they do. The crime that they're being accused of is so horrific. But folks like Ida B. Wells and others end up investigating these cases, and they're like, wait a minute, sexual assault only shows up in like a small fraction of these cases. Lynching is actually just a tool of social control. It's
Mhm.
a way to quote unquote keep the Negro in his place, where his place is exploitable thing. And the fact of the matter is that all it is terrorism. It's racial
Right.
terrorism. It's you do these ridiculous things to these individuals to get communities to stay in line, to get communities to stop seeking economic independence and things like that. It's why people would make the decision to do some of these lynchings outside of Black churches, because we know that's where Black people gather. We know that when they go to worship tomorrow morning, this is the first thing they're going to see, so that they see this is what happens when you step out of line. And so in many ways, it is greed that starts that phenomenon. It's greed that continues it and feeds it, and it's greed that ends it as well, because it doesn't end because it doesn't end because there's some moral revolution where
No.
people are like, oh no, we probably shouldn't burn people alive in front of thousands of people. No, it ends because it becomes a national embarrassment. You start having editorials coming out of places like France and Japan saying, what are these Americans doing?
Yeah.
These Americans are barbaric. And especially at a time when the South is seeking to industrialize, and it's seeking northern investment, to have that as a stain on its reputation, it's not going to fly. So lynching ends because it's bad for business, not just because, like I said, there's some kind of moral revolution where we figure out that it's wrong.
I thought we had become the city on the hill finally, and just or that beacon to the rest of the world. But really, what you're saying is we're just motivated by greed, and greed will actually compel us to do horrific things to the rest of the world and to our neighbors.
Yep. And the violence, I mean, because the violence stops in or fades in that particular form, but the violence doesn't go away. One of the other reasons why lynching fades is because Black people leave the South. So you have the great migration, where 6 million Afro-Americans move from the South to the North. But what you also notice is that in the cities that they move to, there's still violence against their communities, because they become competition for labor, and so then because of that, they become targets. The issue at root is still not dealt with. And so that's one of the things that I want to press in this book. I'm like, if we really want to deal with this issue, then we're going to have to deal with it at its root. We're going to have to stop messing with the extremities of the demon and go for its heart.
So, given then where we are currently, we're 30 days into the new administration, and we're seeing a replay. And I know you've probably had this question and been talking about this a lot, but like, are we just seeing greed rear its ugly head again? And that, like, if something doesn't change, we're steps away from racial violence again? Like,
yeah. So my thing is that, I mean, Mammon. So yeah, I think we are in an age right now. I mean, Mammon has been on the American throne for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But now it's nakedly on the throne.
Right.
Just obviously so.
Yeah.
And like in a way that is, if we're not already there, moving very quickly towards authoritarianism. And it is my fear is, well, it's not a fear. But it doesn't just indicate, I think, the coming of racial violence. I'm just thinking about violence in general. I mean, because for the rich to make as much as they do, violence must be used. And I'm not and that's not just in the category of lynching. I consider I consider people being kept from the resources that they need to be able to live and survive. I consider that to be violence.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about when we're talking about mass illegal firings, I consider that to be violence. You are essentially removing people's livelihoods from them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. And the fact of the matter is that and I think I told I told my church this, that Christians do have an abundance of resources of thinking about how to live under authoritarian governments. It's called the New Testament.
Yeah.
And so one of my things in the book is just, I'm like, look, in the midst of all this stuff, because I wrote the book about racial capitalism, but the logic of exploitation, violence, and lies is also just broadly the logic of evil. And so the three things that I call them to in the second half of the book are I think the most significant acts of resistance now, given our current milieu. And those three things are also just kind of basic things that Christ has called us to do. So as much as it might seem, as much as it may seem that the world is falling apart and all this kind of stuff, I think part of it is because we've gotten used to having a certain amount of power, and we've placed our faith in that influence. And when it's gone, we're just like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, we should have been thinking in the terms that Christ has called us to think the whole time. It would have prepared us. It would have prepared us well for this.
What, you mean the Sermon on the Mount and the book of Acts might actually...
Like, they're actually relevant. Like, they're actually things that we should read and then, like, believe that Christ is actually talking to us and actually telling us how we should live. As opposed to thinking, well, Jesus said that, but, like, he probably didn't actually mean it. Here are some other ways that I'll qualify those things. No, just read what... Listen to Jesus. Do what he says. That's the whole book. That's the whole book, Andrew. That's all I'm trying to tell people.
It really is. And I want to get to those practices because I think they're actually of vital importance, But another point in which I struggled with your book is your book doesn't give much hope for engaging in a worldly system. You give a lot of hope to the church, and I do, and Jesus, right? But like, as we think about engagement, and I was just sitting down with some people I'm getting to know from my local church, because we're all figuring out, like, okay, how do we respond? And is there a way to be involved without succumbing to this demonic cycle? Really, like, and that, like, do we need to become Anabaptists and withdraw? Like, which I don't think you're advocating for, but like, I feel like I don't know the middle ground yet, and I think a lot of us are trying to figure this out and wanting to do it in a way that is life-giving versus succumbing to greed, exploitation, extraction. So is there a way, like,
So a lot of the, a lot of the distinctives that I name in the book are also like Mennonite Anabaptist distinctives. But I don't think that necessarily manifests itself in a withdrawing. It means that when you are committed to these things in whatever space you find yourself in, you will likely be pushed out of those spaces. But a lot of us are too afraid to be pushed out of those spaces to actually live in the way that Christ has called us to actually live in the way that Christ has called us to live. And so
that phrase feels like it needs to be repeated, because we're too afraid to be pushed out of the spaces we're in because we're too afraid to live as Christ called us to live. Like,
yes. I think fear. I mean, really, I just think we're afraid. And so, and I think we're afraid to actually be beacons of the kingdom of God in the midst of the kingdoms of the world, because there's part of us that knows if we actually do commit to those things consistently, people are going to think we're weird. People are going to think that first of all, we're going to likely actively undermine a number of the systems that we're a part of. And nobody's going to like that. Like, it's just like, there is the constant temptation, I think, for us to kind of go along to get along. And that's exactly what It's exactly what the Asian churches in the book of Revelation are also facing. But I'll share this. I want to share this because when this happened for me a few weeks ago, it jettisoned all that fear for me. So, and this is like the sermon that I give to everybody now. Once this happened to me a few weeks ago, I was like, I have to share this. So, at the end of Revelation 3, well, we'll start with Revelation 4 and 5. So Revelation 4 and 5, John is taken into the throne room of God, and he sees something sitting on the throne. It's got the appearance of precious stones, but it has a hand, and in its hand is a scroll. And then in the beginning of chapter 5, the Lamb shows up in the middle of the throne, takes the scroll out of the hand of the one sitting on the throne. And as I was reading through that again, I was like, oh, so John is seeing the Father on his throne. He can't say that because nobody can say that. Like nobody can see the Father. The Father sits in unapproachable light. Like there's no one. Yeah. But that's what he's describing. He can't say it, but that's what he's describing. Okay. Father on the big throne. Lamb is also on the big throne. Okay. End of Revelation 3. He's talking to the church at Laodicea. And Jesus says, I know your works. You're lukewarm. You're neither hot nor cold. And because you're neither hot nor cold, I'm about to vomit you out of my mouth. So something about you makes me nauseous. Then he explains it's because you're rich and you say you need nothing when you're actually wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Okay. And then at the end of that text, it's Revelation 3:20. Jesus says, to the one who overcomes, I will give to them the right to sit with me on my throne, just as when I overcame, I sat with my Father on his throne. Now, the image at the end of Revelation and also in Daniel 7 is that the saints will rule alongside Christ. And you might think that what that means is that, well, like we're going to have like little thrones next to Jesus. And that's not what Jesus says at the end of Revelation 3. He says, you get to sit with me on the big chair, like with me and the Father on the big chair. Because and that's why it makes me so nauseous when you get caught up in greed, political power, cultural influence, and stuff like that, because it's a refusal for you to really take seriously what it is that I've prepared for you. This is why you seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, because God cares for you. Your need, God will care about your needs because he's think of what he has for you. Why would you get so stressed out about all this little stuff? When you get stressed out about some multi-billionaire who wants to take your job, okay, you serve a God. You serve a God who sits on the throne of the universe, a God who has promised not only a God who has promised not only justice but an actual comprehensive justice, the likes of which you can't even imagine. That's the God that you seek. That's the God in whose shadow you live, and that's the God whom you obey. And one of the ways that empires like to reign is specifically through fear, as though they're the ones who dictate our circumstances. And if there is one thing that the Christian ought to be able to be, it ought to be a person who's not enslaved to that fear. Last point, in Hebrews, one of my favorite texts is when the author tells us kind of one of the reasons why the incarnation happens, why the Son of God takes on flesh. It says that as the children have flesh and blood, he also partook of the same, so that he might break the power of him who has the power of death, that is the devil, and also that he might free those who all their lives were held in slavery to the fear of death. Like that's one of the reasons of the incarnation, was to free us from our slavery to the fear of death.
Yeah.
And so as, like I said, as the church, one of the things that we have to train ourselves out of is that fear.
Yeah.
Because we're constantly going to be assaulted. We're going to constantly be assaulted by it. And so what is it? What vision of Christ, who he is and who he's called us to be, is going to drive that fear out of our souls and actually equip us to actually love our neighbors and to love our brothers and sisters and to love our enemies as Christ has called us to.
I thought it was 7 tips on how to be successful. Like I thought that was the next sermon series. Like what?
Or
we take a look and deeply into some practices you call us to of deep economic solidarity, creative anti-violence, and prophetic truth-telling. Like, given that you just presented us this beautiful vision, like of what the world can be, and what the world actually is, because as you tell us, our job is not to change the world, but to proclaim that the change has already happened, which growing up evangelical, like I was told to change the world. Like,
of course.
My whole life is a lie, Malcolm. Like,
see, this is why I want people to read the book, because after you read it, you're without excuse. So
yeah, thanks. So great. Now I have more responsibility. That's not less. Like,
but here's the thing. But this is also the hope. Like it's not like I'm really removing a burden from your shoulders, because because as you look, and this is what I think one of the great things about the Book of Revelation, because you're looking at the church under Roman imperial persecution, essentially, and the image that John gets is, hey, like, I know Rome's really scary. It's actually even scarier than that. Like, there are actually beasts with a bunch of heads and horns and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's actually even scarier than it appears. But remember who's on your side: the Lamb who was slain. And the fact that that's true relativizes all of that fear. And that's what that's what I want. Like, people get caught up in, for example, in thinking about racism, getting bound up in not just the individual, but the systemic. Like, it's scary when you see how big it is. And so one of the things that I would say is, like, hey, actually, it's even bigger than that, because Mammon is actually an enemy that Jesus names, and that's what's actually behind all this. So that is actually scarier. But understand that the resources that God has given his people to engage in that cosmic battle are resources the likes of which that you haven't thought to tap into, and yet they are resources that are greater than anything that you could imagine too. And so you don't have to feel like you've got to change our global economic system, because that's not what he's called the church to do. What he's called the church to do is to be an invitation to the world to a new way of life. And people are going to find new ways to exploit and dominate each other, because that's what sin is going to do. Yeah. But we have an opportunity, like I said, to show the world that there's another way, to live. And that's an invitation to the world, not a judgment of it, not a withdrawal from it, but a necessary invitation, because we want people to experience this joy and this peace and this power along with us.
Right. No, but the invitation is anti-American dream.
Yeah, it is.
Like, so yes, you're taking a burden off of us, but you're also the invitation, which rightfully so, like, it resonates deeply, is not what we're usually told. And so like as you said, we don't need to just break down the system. We need a whole new creative imagination to think of how to actually be Jesus followers. Like, and so, like, deep economic solidarity, that sounds nice, but like, to actually do that, like, that requires a deep imagination within the church and breaking down systems in the church that, I'm not employed by a church. My wife, my family and I, we attend a church. We like our church. Yeah. But to, like, talk about deep economic solidarity, creative anti-violence, and prophetic truth-telling, like, those are still systems that I'm not in control of. And, most of my listeners aren't in control of, and so it's trying to shape this life. How do we actually shape a life like this, given when we feel powerless? Yeah.
So it's one of the reasons why I wanted to frame those three things in some relatively simple way. So I'll talk through kind of each of those three. So on the deep economic solidarity point, one of the points I want to make, especially in that chapter, is that the opposite of greed is not necessarily generosity. just because generosity can very easily turn into paternalism.
Yep.
It can very easily turn into, well, look at all this that I have. You have so little. Let me part ways with some of what I have out of my own magnanimity.
Yeah.
And I can remain in the position of giver. You're in the position of receiver. Then we can go on with our lives.
Yeah.
And that's not the way that Christ gave to us. He actively became one of us so that he might bring us up to where he is. We're talking about solidarity for the purpose of uplift, but not just uplift, but with the goal, as Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 8, when he's talking about the relationship between Corinthians and Macedonians, the goal is equality.
Yeah.
So, and it's sharing for that purpose. It's sharing for the purpose that everybody has everything that they need. And as an example of that, you have the church in Acts. In Acts 2, after the Spirit descends on the people of God, they're devoted to 4 things: devotion to the apostles' teaching, eating together, prayer, and the fellowship. And the fellowship, koinonia, otherwise it's variably translated as fellowship, participation, sharing. Yeah. Well, the question is, what are they sharing? Well, we're told in the text, they're sharing their material goods. They're meeting each other's material needs. And in chapter 4, we're told that God's grace was so powerfully at work among them that there were no needy people in their midst. That the physical manifestation of God's grace was the fact that there were no needy people in their midst. Not because they kicked the needy out, but because when the needy came in, the community gathered around to meet those needs. That's not that's not like an idiosyncrasy of the early church. That's the way that the Christian community is necessarily supposed to look. One of the primary witnesses of the Christian church is supposed to be its economic witness. Wow. And I think that, I think one of the things that's been diluted is what we think the witness of our community is. And what we see in Acts 2 and Acts 4 is in many ways a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 15, when God set up this economic system for his people. And he's like, hey, if you do all the things that I command you, there won't be any poor people in your midst, because this structure will be in place. But he also says in that chapter, don't harbor, because this is the chapter with the Jubilee. He says, if someone comes to you in need, don't harbor the wicked thought, well, the year of Jubilee is coming, so I don't have to do anything. Because he's like, I don't care if there is a just system. You, both individually and communally, have a necessary commitment to the needy in your midst. And so this is my response to people who might be against the government caring for the poor in any way, because that's what the church is supposed to do. I'm like, look, I want everybody to care. I want everybody to care for the poor and the needy. And even if they don't, I still have that responsibility. Even if whether they do or they don't, I and my community still have that responsibility. As a matter of fact, that ought to be our first financial priority. And so if we're looking at church budgets and stuff, it's asking the question, okay, how are we working towards a situation where we see the church primarily as a redistributive entity? That when I'm giving to this community, what I'm especially giving to is a redistribution among the people who have needs, such that we're building a community where there isn't need. And then if that's happening in my community, how am I then sharing that with not only other Christian communities in my midst, but how is that also bleeding into the city in which I find myself? But the first step, like I said, I think the first step is for you to get it in those smaller communities, because then that ethos can overflow.
Yeah, a little yeast leavens the whole dough, right? It does take a small work, and it does take people committing to saying, okay, no, there's got to be a different way of being. In the midst of the chaos, or in the midst of whatever circumstances we find ourselves in.
I guess that was just the economic solidarity point.
Yeah. Because then you call us to creative anti-violence, which is like, well, I guess churches got to get rid of their security teams, which I've always had a problem with. But it's beside.
Man, this is the most controversial. I really do think this is actually the most controversial point.
Really?
Because
over economic solid, because you're asking.
I know, that's what I thought. I didn't think this was what really makes people angry, especially on Instagram, is, is like, I mean, it's not just the stuff against the rich, because people really want to be rich. So anything I say about the rich,
Yeah.
they're just like, you're speaking against my imagined future state. But
It's true. I'm one good decision away from my millions.
exactly right. But the violence thing, like whenever, like when I can really strongly say that there is that the Christian ought have no involvement in lethal violence, the first response is, well, what about this random situation where I think that the only proper response in this situation is to kill somebody? And my response to that is like, what kind of moral imagination meets with the words of Christ and thinks, well, here are some exceptions. No. Like the first way that we ought to think is, okay, well, this is the way that Christ has called me to live. I can't imagine what I would do in this situation, but I need to trust you, Lord, and your Holy Spirit to be able to help me figure out how to be obedient to you in those moments. Because the thing that is most important to me is that I'm obedient to the Lord. And so the point about the creative anti-violence point is that, you know, I don't necessarily use the language of nonviolence, because it can suggest to folks that it's just the refusal to engage in violence.
Right.
I use the word anti to basically indicate that that our goal is not just to not engage in that violence, but to actively undermine the violence that our brothers, sisters, and neighbors are subjected to. And so, because, you know, as I think about the Westminster Catechism has when they refer to each of the commandments, there are the sins forbidden, and then there are the duties required. And with the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, in the duties required, it basically requires us to endeavor for the preservation of the lives of ourselves and others. That is, it's not enough for me to just not kill you. Like, I have to actively support your life.
Yeah.
Which is also biblically the definition of love. And I'm not just called to love my neighbor and my brother and sister. I'm also called to love my enemies, which means, and this is one of the things I press in the book, that love is necessarily a material relationship, and it extends even to our enemies. I think about at the end of Romans 12. Not only does Paul tell us not to seek revenge, but to leave room for the wrath of God. But then he says, if your enemy is hungry, not that you starve them. Your enemy's hungry, you give them something to eat. Your enemy's thirsty, you give them something to drink. And so, given those texts, there is nothing in there that gives me the leeway to think that love of my neighbor is going to mean killing them. Like, that's just, when I see the scriptures, that's just, like, the very simple argument for anti-violence is that, like, I don't see any room in there for me to interpret killing my neighbor as an act of love. I just don't. And so, yeah, it's going to require creativity, because we are bred in a society of violence that sees that. I mean, I was named after Malcolm X, and so when I hear his speeches, they're really compelling because they're just so rational. Somebody comes at you, you put them down. Like, it just, you're worth protecting, so protect yourself. I'm like, oh, it makes so much sense. But it's not what Jesus said.
No, right. Yeah. No.
So, you know, so that's challenging. That's challenging for a lot of folks. And we can talk about that too. And then, but then last, briefly, the prophetic truth-telling thing. Even especially now, we are constantly surrounded by lies. And race is one of those things, but it's a lie for a particular purpose. And so we have to be a people who are deeply committed to telling the truth, even in situations where people don't want to hear it. But if we really do believe that the truth actively sets people free, then we have to be a people committed to that truth, not only telling the truth about ourselves, but also telling the truth about the world in which we find ourselves. And so when we know that greed is on the throne, we have to be willing to say greed appears to be on the throne. So
Yeah.
like, you can't mince words about it. Just tell the truth.
Right.
Tell the truth and shame the devil. So that's that's in a nutshell. Those are, I think, some of the simple things that I'm trying to remind us to.
Yeah. And to remind listeners, when you talk about violence, you're not just talking about physical violence. You're talking psychological violence, loss of jobs, hunger. You know, like, it's not enough just to take away guns. It's how, like you said, love is a material act. And so it's making sure my neighbors, my community has access to food, has access to housing, has access, and I think, food insecurity and housing, is one thing you latch on to.
Those are the two things I named. Because those are because the examples of love that are given, especially throughout the New Testament, are like, if your brother or sister doesn't have food or clothing, shelter, like that, you don't just pray for them. You don't just pray, go be warm and well fed. Like, you figure out ways to get them food and clothing and shelter. And those are very basic needs that we as church communities, like, we can set that as a priority. I want to make sure that everybody, not only everybody in my midst can eat, but are there ways that I can make sure that everybody in my city can eat? Those are the kinds of things that we ought to be using our creative energies for. And they're very material. They're material ways for us to love our neighbors. And Christ has called us to do two things: to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. Those are the only two things that matter. So everything in our lives ought to be oriented toward those ends.
You make it all sound so simple, and yet I also sense this frustration too of like, gosh darn it, church! Like, what's the problem? Like what?
I know. Sorry, it comes out.
No,
like, this is also how I preach too. But but part of the writing of this book is that, there has been a veil that has been essentially placed over the people of God, a very thick veil where people don't think in those simple terms. They're encouraged to think that everything is so much more complicated than that. Yeah. And that's what our political economy has in many ways done to us. I talk about this with especially the neoliberal and financialized elements of it, is that it obscures so many elements of our interdependence. And I want to remind people of how much our lives are intertwined with one another. But I also want to kind of tear that veil and have people recognize that, like, yes, we spend so much energy trying to not appear to be racist. But what's really important to me is that we're not actually greedy. Because if we deal with that, we're actually going to deal with a lot of other things too. When we don't see everything that we have as something to just be held on to, such that everybody we come into contact with is a threat.
Yeah.
When that fundamentally changes about us, then we'll realize a number of other ways that we're exploiting and dominating our neighbors.
So you're saying that it's easier for the church to talk about racism than it is to talk about greed?
1,000,000%. People have racial reconciliation Sundays and stuff. People don't have anti-greed Sundays. And it's the sin that Jesus talks about the most.
Yep.
Exactly. I see that.
Yeah. I don't know what else to say. Like, so go ahead, please. And so I'm curious, like, because you're a pastor too, so you're not just writing, you're actually trying to engage with people and challenge them to live this out. So, like, obviously each community is different. So, like, what works for you in Waco, Texas will not work for my community in Flagstaff. But I'm curious, like, for our listeners, like, how is this manifesting itself in your church as you're seeking to shepherd a people? And I realize that's a long, hard work, and it may never be, but, I'm curious, like, what it looks like for you as you pastor.
The first step is to The first step is to get people much more comfortable with asking for help.
Hmm.
Because one of the ways that neoliberal capitalism kind of malforms us is that it pushes us to think about self-sufficiency as our primary goal.
Yeah.
Like, I really don't ever want to be a burden. I want to be able to do all this stuff by myself. And that's just not the way that the body of Christ is meant to operate. In the text that where Jesus is talking about greed, this happens in this particular text. I believe it shows up in each of the synoptic gospels, but basically it says that anybody who gives up land, father, brother, sister, all these things for my sake will gain those same things hundredfold in this life with persecution and eternal life in the life to come. And what I take that text to mean is that whatever you give up for the kingdom, you regain 100-fold in joining with the Christian community, because you gain the resources of that community. And so you gain resources that you could never have imagined, because you're now linked into a family. So when you're in a job where like your next step would require you essentially to maybe dominate or exploit your neighbor or whatever, like a lot of people will go through the thought process of, well, I'm the only one who cares about my family, and the only way for me to keep this job is for me to do this thing. And one of the comforts that Christ offers is, actually, I'm binding you to a community where you are actually not the only person who cares about your family. You got a community of people who care about your family. So if you need to make a decision in obedience to me, that's going to get that's essentially going to force you out of this job. That's fine, because I have you covered. And one of the ways in which I have you covered is through the people of God. So I think about this in the first few centuries. There were a number of Christians there were a number of thinkers in the church who pressed, hey, if you're going to be a Christian, you can't be in the military. And so when folks in the military would be converted, like, they'd be encouraged to leave the military. And you got folks where your entire life revolves around the military. And so you're like, well, you want me to give up like my livelihood and all that kind of stuff? And they're like, yeah, join this community. We'll support you and stuff like that, but be obedient to the Lord, because one of the primary functions of this community that we're building is a community that especially supports you when you end up making those costly decisions. You're not just kind of left out in the cold. Christ has actually made provision for you in this community. And so, but in order to become those kinds of communities, we also have to be communities that are willing to ask for help. Because one of the things that we do when we don't and seek self-sufficiency in just kind of this single-minded way, we refuse to give others the opportunity to love us. And if we're to be, like I said, communities where, as Jesus says, you'll know that the world will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. We essentially refuse one another the opportunity to actually express that. And so it begins there. And then we think through the fact that, hey, everything that I have is meant to be shared. There are things that my brother or sister has that I need. There are things that I have that they need. So we need to be engaged in this constant exchange, which is what equality is. Equality is not just a state. It's a relationship of consistent exchange, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so those are the kinds of, like, that's the kind of training that our churches need to go through. That's also part of training in nonviolence too, that we think about ways that we can resolve the problems in our midst through that sharing. Like, all of those are seemingly little things, but they reshape, they kind of reshape and retrain us in, I think, ways that are much more Christ-like.
No, I love that, of just looking towards their community and seeing, if this community that God has given us through his son, like, if we are called into it, it will be a reciprocal love. But where if I focus solely on my family, I'm going to hoard and I'm going to withdraw, you know, might be an order of loves that, we need to talk about versus,
Maybe we
maybe.
should.
Oh,
Yeah, and this is something, I'm really thankful. I'm really, really thankful to have a church where, I could say some of this stuff in some churches and just be run out of the place. But I have a community that I love that hears these things and they're like, oh yeah, like that is what Jesus said. We should probably figure out how to make that work.
yeah.
But I think it's also important to note that, my hope is not in that particular community. My hope is rooted in the fact that, like, Christ has actually told us to do these things, and Christ doesn't tell us to do anything that he hasn't promised to equip us to do. And so I trust him, and I trust in the tremendous power of the Holy Spirit to, even in these situations where I can't necessarily imagine a way forward. That's where I go to the Lord. I go to my co-pastor, my fellow elders, the rest of the church, for us to think about, hey, this is what Christ has called us to do. Let's figure out together how to do it.
Yeah. No, I love that of, going to the community and figuring it out, discerning together. Because we're not alone in this.
No.
No. And we were never meant to be alone.
No. We weren't.
No.
But this is what neoliberal capitalism does to us. It atomizes us. It makes us think that any successes that I enjoy are entirely because I worked really hard. And any failures that I suffer, it's probably my own failure. I didn't work hard enough. I wasn't competitive enough, or whatever. And I'm the only one who got me where I am, and I'm the only one who can get me out of whatever I'm in.
Yeah.
And all that it's also just exhausting. It's so exhausting and depressing.
Right. Yeah. No, it is. I feel like we could go on and on for more and more, and we didn't even get to talk about food and hospitality, but yeah, it's all good because actually it all is intertwined, I think, and how this way forward and how but as we begin to wrap up, it's a question I ask all of my guests, and you've hinted at it, but I think it provides a summary too, is what's the story you want the church to tell?
I want people to hear. I want us to be a community that trumpets the fact that in the cross, Christ embarrassed the powers and principalities. So where the powers and principalities of greed, of power, and all of especially diminutive power, where all of those things claim to have so much power over our lives, Christ by the cross reveals them to be essentially powerless. And so we have an opportunity to build communities that actually bear witness to that fact. That where everybody else may be running around with their chickens with their heads cut off, we're a people who ought to be able to, as we're called to in Revelation 13, after these crazy descriptions of these beasts which represent empires. The call in the middle of Revelation 13 is this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the people of God. So are we a people who are being trained to patiently endure and to be faithful in the midst of whatever it is that we might face? When we are known for our patient endurance and faithfulness, when we're known for our economic witness, for our devotion to the apostles' teaching, for our eating together and prayer, even in the midst of chaos, I think that's a compelling picture. And then when people ask us, well, how is this possible? We're like, well, that's the work of the Holy Spirit. And if you repent and believe, you can get in on this. You can get in on this too.
Yeah. Come and meet my Savior. Come see.
Come on.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. I love your vision. I love your heart, Malcolm.
Thank you, man.
It is inspiring, challenging. But like you said, Jesus gave us a gentle yoke, an easy yoke. And so if he's called us to this way of living, it has to be possible.
Yep.
And it's not through grit. It's not through, just pulling up myself up by my bootstraps. Like, it's the power of the Spirit.
The mighty power of the Spirit.
If he can raise Jesus from the dead, that same Spirit, lives in us.
Come on.
So, finally, some questions about food, because, it's just some fun questions to wrap up. What's one food you refuse to eat?
Ooh, food I refuse to eat. Ice cream.
No, our question is if you love Jesus. Like, what's going on?
Ice cream. That's the first thing that came to mind. Yeah, I mean the short story is I had a recurring nightmare when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I would wake up, it'd be completely dark, there'd be no sound. I'd go out into the hallway right outside my bedroom, and there'd be a glowing neon green 3-scoop ice cream cone, and it had 4 arms. It would grab pieces of itself and throw them at me. So I was afraid of ice cream for a little while. I'm not afraid of it anymore. I just don't play games with it. So
okay.
There we go.
Yeah. It's always, sometimes I hear the answers I never expected, and ice cream was not one I thought I would hear, but
there you go.
Thank you for your honesty.
That may alienate people more than the Christian socialism thing. So sorry about that.
Creative anti-violence doesn't eat ice cream. Christian socialism, like you're winning with the white evangelical church right now, Malcolm. Come on in. And then on the other end of the spectrum, what's one of the best things you've ever eaten?
Oh, okay. Like I really like beef is my favorite. Beef is really like my favorite food. So a really good steak brings me joy. Probably like steak and really good lemonade. Like those are my two kind of favorite things that consistently fill me with joy.
Gotcha. Do you have a specific favorite cut of steak?
Ribeye. I mean, ribeye for sure.
All right. Okay.
The great thing about Texas, there's this every state can be a mixed bag, but the great thing about Texas is I can just get really good quality beef just from the grocery store. It's not and it's not super and it's not expensive.
Yeah.
So
I was worried you were going to say filet, and then I was going to be like, okay, no ice cream, and now you like filet. I'm like, come on, wait.
No.
Okay. I was beginning to question if we could be friends, Malcolm, but now
yeah, don't worry. See, okay, good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad this is still gonna work out.
Yeah. And then finally, there's a conversation among chefs about last meals, as in if you knew you had one more meal to enjoy, what would it be? And so if Malcolm had one last meal, what would he enjoy?
Well, I guess I've already named kind of 2 elements of it, because the steak would have to be in it. Lemonade to drink. Let me think of what starch. Okay. Well, macaroni and cheese would have to be the starch, and then as a vegetable,
do you need a vegetable if you're going to meet Jesus?
I did. Fair point.
Like, I just want to take that pressure off of you.
That's a fair point. I appreciate that. See, I appreciate you liberating me from that particular bondage. Wait. If I have to think about it, it's clearly not on the forefront of my mind. So there we go.
There you go. There's no right or wrong. Like, you don't have to have this. You don't have to eat what your mama told you on this meal. Like, it's not. There's no rules.
Oh man. I think I would still do. I would actually. I still kind of, for some reason, I'd still want it to be balanced in some way.
No,
like a sautéed spinach, a sauce like a garlic sautéed spinach. I'd probably good. I'd be good with that.
Okay.
But yeah, that would I think frame it out.
Awesome. Well, Malcolm, this has been fun. I've really enjoyed it. Enjoy your laugh. I enjoy your prophetic truth telling and your invitation to all of us. And if people want to learn more about your work, is there a place they can find you?
Yeah, so I'm still on Twitter right now. We'll see how much longer that lasts. But I'm on Blue Sky at Malcolm B Foley. And then Instagram, it's Rev Doc Malk. And yeah.
Yeah.
And then actually my co-pastor and I have a podcast called Theology in Pieces.
Hmm.
And I'll occasionally write for the Anxious Bench,
Nice.
the Pathos blog as well.
Okay.
But the main thing is pick up the book.
Pick up the book. Definitely. No. Yeah. The Anti-Greed Gospel. It's available now wherever you get your books. Maybe not Amazon anymore, but find a local bookstore,
Yeah, local bookstore, and then put reviews on Amazon so that people see it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. It's all tied up. I'm like, okay, if I do that, yeah.
I know. It's my way of undermining the system. I'll use the system to undermine the system.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing it with others. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Biggest Table, where we explore what it means to be transformed by God's love around the table and through food. Until next time, bye.